Now I am really excited to welcome Kidada E. Williams, author of They Left Great Marks on Me, African-American Testimonies of Racial Violence from Emancipation to World War I. And she's also the producer and host of the great podcast, Seizing Freedom. Dr. Williams, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for covering this amazing topic.
No doubt, no doubt. I'm so excited to dig into this illegal history with you as it's become in so many states. I think it's now 42 states that have laws and trying to ban history, or I think, as you put it before the session started, these white comfort laws that want to mandate that we lie to kids about structural racism. And I'm so glad that many of us are refusing to do that. And there's a lot of leaders here with us today in that struggle. So I'm excited to dig into this history with you. And I think it's so incredible that you've started this Seizing Freedom podcast. I've really enjoyed the podcast. The script writing is so engaging. The production quality is off the charts. I feel like I'm watching a play when I'm listening to all the soundscapes and the different voices that bring to life this history of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, resistance to lynching, just the ongoing Black freedom struggle that you document so well. And I just wanted to start tonight by asking you, why a podcast, right? So what does that medium allow you to do? And then I'm also curious if you could comment why this medium would be good for educators. How can we use your podcast and other podcasts, or encourage students to make their own? What's useful about it?
So I love podcasts, even before I started hosting one. And I think the medium allows you to deliver and receive a diverse range of information. So you've got a combination of scripted narratives like Seizing Freedom, and also arresting conversations with really smart people. And I think history podcasts in particular are doing some of the most amazing storytelling work out there. And what we have is, rather than simply watching yet another screen, we know we've all been sort of committed to our screens during the pandemic, teachers and students can listen and imagine themselves in whatever time or place is being discussed. And so podcasts, I think, engage our senses and our brains in different ways. Like, our brains receive and process information when we hear the information differently than it does when we're looking at it. So it's slower, and I think it kind of sinks in. And so I think a show like Seizing Freedom is a great example of this. We tell a new and very accessible history of African Americans' fight for freedom, using a mix of the best scholarly research that's out there and some of the most engaging stories from the men and women who fought for freedom. And so we've got these letters, testimonies, newspaper reports, autobiographies, and all of these other sources to tell this story. And our voice actors bring these amazing people to life, these stories to life. And students and teachers can listen to the emotion behind the text, right? A self-emancipated man who's asking to enlist, like Harry Jarvis, a father determined to get his daughters back. And through these kinds of sources, I think that students and teachers can get a greater sense of who the people were, who these people were who completely changed the course of American history. And I think teachers can also they can create classroom exercises guiding students into a much deeper analysis of these sources. So we give you a little bit, but the larger sources are available for examination in the classroom. So that's what I kind of think podcasts do.
I love that. I love what you said about bringing the emotion behind the text. And that's, the textbooks they give us to teach out of are just so dry, right? Forget the fact that they lie to kids, right? They're just straight up boring from whatever perspective that they're examining. And your podcast really does bring that emotion behind the words, I think, in a way that would be highly engaging for youth. So I wanted to start by asking more about the master narratives that you explore on the Civil War. You know, these were master narratives that were taught to me and are taught to the vast majority of students, the idea that Lincoln freed the slaves, right? But the reality is, as you say in the podcast, quote, Black people, North and South, free and enslaved, were active agents in their own emancipation before, during, and after the Civil War. And so I was hoping you could talk more about how Black people, men and women, participated in seizing their freedom from slavery. But I wanted to just start by playing 4 short excerpts from your podcast that explain this point, and then ask you to elaborate on that, if it's all right. Yeah. with you. Excellent, because I hope everyone will get an understanding for what a powerful tool these podcasts could be. And we're going to start with Harry Jarvis, who had run away from the Virginia plantation on which he was enslaved.
I went to him and asked him to let me enlist, but he said it wasn't a black man's war. I told him it would be a black man's war before they got through.
Okay, now we're going to hear from Cornelius Gardner, a formerly enslaved soldier in Virginia.
Frederick Douglass told Abe Lincoln, "Give the black man guns and let him fight." And Abe Lincoln say, "If I give him a gun, when it comes to battle, he might run." And Frederick Douglass say, "Try him, and you'll win the war." And Abe say, "All right, I'll try him."
Man, I'm glad Frederick Douglass said that. Okay, Susie King Taylor, a formerly enslaved woman who worked for the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, the first Black regiment in the U.S. Army.
I assisted in cleaning the guns and used to fire them off to see if the cartridges were dry before cleaning and reloading each day. I learned to handle a musket very well and could shoot straight and often hit the target. I thought this great fun. I was able to take a gun all apart and put it together again.
Right on. And then Rosanna Henson to Abraham Lincoln.
My husband, who is now in the Macon Hospital at Portsmouth with a wound in his arm, has not received any pay since last May, and then only $13. I have 4 children to support, and I find this a great struggle. A hard life, this. I, being a colored woman, do not get any state pay. Yet my husband is fighting for the country.
Yeah. So talk about what these all represent.
So you mentioned the master narrative, and there is this whole mythology about Black people in the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. And it sort of goes that they sat passively, waiting for white people to free them from slavery, that Reconstruction failed. And these are the stories that many white Americans have told themselves and anyone who would listen. But professional historians for the past couple of decades have known that the historical records of the time tell a very different story. And you could hear that in these clips. These are people who African Americans did not sit passively waiting for anyone to free them. They freed themselves. You've got hundreds of thousands of people self-emancipating during the war. They are fleeing bondage like Harry Jarvis. They're showing up in Union camps like Susie King Taylor, and they are doing what they can to join the Union effort so they can secure their freedom and that of their people. And so, you've got this master narrative, but that narrative serves a particular end. But this story, when you look at the history of the Civil War from the perspective of the Black people who were living in it, who changed the course of American and African American history through their fight for freedom, you get a completely different, it's not only a more accurate story, but it's a different story. And it's a story that actually makes more sense for understanding the nation at the time and the world we live in today.
No doubt. Yeah, I love that. I heard the desertion of Black people from plantations during the Civil War described as the largest general strike in U.S. history, and that's what finally brought the Confederacy that was winning the war down, right? And that's not not what I was taught at all. So I really appreciate that, and everyone should check out that podcast episode for sure. And then your work around Reconstruction, I feel like, is some of the most important, and it's become a focus of the Zen Education Project. We just released a report on the state standards on Reconstruction that are just abysmal. And so I especially appreciated your Reconstruction podcasts. And you tell the story of a 17-year-old enslaved person named Mary Armstrong, who lived in Missouri, which was a Union slaveholding state during the Civil War. And she got her free papers in 1863, the same year of the Emancipation Proclamation. And targeting slavery in states that had seceded, right? So she thought that her mom might be living in one of those states in the Confederacy in Texas, right? And so Mary decided to set off, and you tell this incredible story, to go look for her mom. And she almost gets re-enslaved in Texas, but she manages to escape. And so I was hoping that you could talk more about the experiences of hundreds of thousands of freed people during Reconstruction in their quest to reunite with loved ones. And maybe just before you say that, we could play a short clip about from Mary.
In 1865, Mary resumed her search for her mother. I found her in Warden County. Lord me, talk about crying and singing and crying some more. We sure did it. I stayed with Mama until I got married.
Whew. Yeah. Talk about what it was like to, in this quest to reunite with family.
So we know that many families were broken up after the American Revolution. So enslaved people's families enjoyed relative stability before the American Revolution, but after the Revolution, especially with westward expansion, we start to see more and more families along the Eastern Seaboard broken up, and even more as you get more westward expansion and as slavery takes a greater hold. And so families are devastated by these separations. And so it would make sense that they would use the chaos of the war to not only escape, but to go in search of their people. And so, this makes sense when you understand that they didn't see themselves as free or completely free unless their people were free. How can you as a daughter be free if your mother is still in bondage? How is you as a father? How can you enjoy your freedom while your children are still held in bondage? So these ties, that sense of family, this sense of kinship, is what's driving that search for family. And people like Mary Armstrong, they take risky moves. She's a 17-year-old girl. Imagine it. She takes off.
Unbelievable.
She gets on a steamboat going south. She goes from camp to camp to camp to camp, town to town, working along the way to find her mother. And she's one of those people who actually is able to do it. She had to travel much further, and a lot of people have to travel that distance are not successful. But there are many people who are, and it's one of the most, I think for me, it's one of the most amazing stories of the period. It shows that their commitment to their people, their sense of their collective freedom and their collective faith, they would be able to make freedom real only with their people. They're not going to be able to do it on their own. They need kin. They need neighbors. They need community to do this work. And so it's one of the many inspiring stories that we tell. And, even if they don't have to go in search of kin, what we see is that they're finding new people. They're starting new families potentially, because you got fairly young people. They're meeting up and they're making free lives together. And they're doing what they can to build a new world. But even as they build this new world, one of the most amazing things, I think, and why we have a story like Mary Armstrong's in the first place, is because they told the future generations. They preserved those stories of who they were, and they passed those stories on to their children and their grandchildren about who they were as individuals and who they were as a people, and what freedom meant to them. And those are the histories that have been ignored or excluded from the mass, as a result of the master narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction. But they're there and they're available for teachers to use, for teachers to read, for teachers to share with their students, to develop lesson plans, to help understand the world as we know it today.
Yeah, no doubt. This episode is just so moving. It just puts you in that place and helps you think about the emotional weight of searching for a family member, never knowing if you were going to be able to reconnect or not, and just the way Black people had to construct their families differently because of this oppression. Thank you for sharing that, for sure. And one of the episodes I most appreciated regarding Reconstruction was the episode about literacy and schooling during Reconstruction. I hope everyone will listen to it in full, but it's especially important to me, the work I'm doing right now on the history of Black education. Just hearing those quotes from people who seeking their education just really brought out, as I told you before the session started, that quote from Du Bois, who said that Black education, or education in the South, was a Negro idea, right? And that Black people built the public school system in the South. And I feel like this so vividly illustrated a couple things to me. First, how despite the narrative that Black people don't value education, perhaps no one in the history of this country has fought harder for access to it. And then second, all these bills banning history, banning the truth, aren't the first time that Black education has come under a sustained assault, right? So what happened? What was the importance of literacy in the post-war South, and how did freed people pursue and use education?
Well, I think it's vitally important, and they understand that education, and but what they mean by that is reading, writing, math, knowledge of the world beyond farms, plantations, homes, and businesses, where they were held in bondage, that this education, this wider education, is essential to their freedom. And what we know is that many of them had been privy to the first education about who they were, about their family history, about local geography, religion, and more. They're not ignorant. I think we need to be clear on that. They just lack formal education, and there's a difference. And another quote that Du Bois, another statement that Du Bois said is that the white South knows an educated Negro is a dangerous Negro, right? Mm-hmm. Because an educated Negro is always going to resist her and his oppression. Mm-hmm. And so, and Du Bois's, statement, his follow-up behind that was, and they were not wrong. Right. And so, right. Only 5 states passed laws prohibiting the teaching of enslaved people to read and write. And that was fairly late in the history of slavery. But most enslavers denied Black people access to formal education as a method of control to keep them in bondage. But that didn't stop Black people from doing anything and everything they could during slavery to learn how to read and write. And so they self-teach, so they teach themselves, they pick up literacy wherever they can, they get formal training, they pass any knowledge they have on to other people. They use their educations to read the Bible for themselves, to read the nation's founding documents for themselves,
That's
to free
dangerous.
themselves. Exactly. To free themselves, to write passes for travel, to write passes to free themselves, to escape from bondage, to secure employment. They use education in all of these ways. And that's why that value of education is something that exists before the war. And during the war, we see evidence of that by the fact that you've got the establishment of schools in refugee and freedmen's camps during the war. They're not waiting passively for the war to end. They are in, those people who are self-emancipating, they are, you sort of see freedom on the move, even in the camps, the refugee camps where they are in the process of making freedom to the best of their ability wherever they are. That means getting married, that means reuniting family, that means going to search for their people, and it means opening schools to start that instruction process. And so that thirst for education is why you see newly freed people creating schools before the Freedmen's Bureau even shows up.
That's right.
And I think it's an important part, that sort of, they're doing that work themselves. They're paying the teachers with chickens, with hogs, etc. They're like, we will build a school, we may not have cash, but we've got these other things that we can provide you. And the teachers are happy to accept that money. And then when the Freedmen's Bureau comes in, what we see is that the free people, they don't surrender their schools voluntarily to the Freedmen's Bureau. They want to say in who the teachers are, how they're going to treat their students, their children, and what they're going to learn. And so what we see is that they're not just interested in reading, writing, and arithmetic. In these freedmen schools, they're learning history, geography, art, literature, right? World history, national history. And so that education is much more expansive than we thought. And our conversation with historian Hillary Green, who researched these schools, details that. So I think teachers can get from the narrative episodes a sense of the history, and from the interview episodes a sense of the sort of scholarly conversations and sometimes a deeper knowledge of the sort of history that goes into the episode. And so our conversation on camps with Abby Cooper is one of the people, is the scholar who found Mary Armstrong's story and fleshed out those details. So if you want to know some of the behind the scenes history, some of the richer history behind the episode, behind the narrative episode, you can listen to the interview episode, because we get into all of that.
Yeah, that's great. And I love some of the discussion too about the struggle over what students were going to learn in those schools, and the white missionary educators having a very different idea of what it meant to be educated than Black educators who came in wanting to empower and weren't shocked that Black people had intellect, right?
Exactly. Right. Some of the white missionaries, they only want them to sort of gain the basic skills so they can be of service. Right. So they can be of service to white people, to the nation, et cetera. But Black parents have a much bigger and much more expansive vision for their children and their future. And they do what they can to fight to make that possible. And we see even after Reconstruction is overthrown, even in those schools, you still have until the early part of the 20th century, Black teachers who are teaching this really expansive, rich history.
Yeah. In some ways, I feel like that still hasn't ended, that struggle over what the purpose of education is, and the fight for Black education in our buildings doesn't look all that different than some of the live debates during Reconstruction, right?
Except we've got the benefit of their experience. So we know the ways they fought, we know the ways they held on to some authority and power to the best of their ability to continue doing that work. And we're doing some of the same kind of work today. Yeah, no doubt. Oh, that's great. So I wanted to ask you one more question before we move into breakout rooms, and we'll give people an opportunity to talk about some of the things they've learned, and then they'll come back and we'll answer questions. But the episode called Walk, the streetcar boycotts, is just so fascinating. And I knew some of like a broad sketch of some of that, but really didn't understand how central struggles to desegregate public transportation were to early fights in the Black freedom struggle. Because between 1900 and 1910, you talk about how Black people were in more than 24 cities organized boycotts of streetcars as one strategy for fighting against the new Jim Crow laws and for greater access to public life. And when these new laws passed in Houston, I love the story that you tell that the segregated public transportation led to a funny story of a white man who tried to get a ride from a Black person who refused him a ride. And so the law says, the new law. He said, I can't take you. The new law says I can't take you. Right?
Sorry about that.
Sorry, man, you got to find another way to work, right?
Right. No doubt.
Yeah, but I also love the stories of, Black people throwing rocks at the streetcars, in protest, showing their frustration with the segregation, but also their very crystal clear sense of community responsibility, and they're policing if anyone who stepped out of line, right? You cross that line, you get on that streetcar if you want to. So it's a problem.
That's right. That's right. So I mean, just the creativity of the Black freedom struggle comes through in this episode so clearly. And so I just was hoping you could talk more about the role of segregating streetcars in establishing Jim Crow, and also just about the movement in Houston, but really all around the country, and challenging these laws, and how our understanding of the civil rights movement really is transformed, right? When we think about the Montgomery Bus Boycott launching the civil rights movement, but very few people know this history from much earlier.
So I'm going to try to be really efficient because it's a little complex. And what I mean by that is white Americans didn't support or need segregation during slavery. They wanted close, intimate proximity to Black people so they could control and dominate them, so they could hold them in bondage, so they could steal their lives and their labors. Emancipation completely changed this dynamic. And the Reconstruction Acts and amendments Reconstruction Acts and amendments give Black people an opportunity to advance, and Black people ran with it. They get educations, they open businesses, they acquire land, they're elected into office, they do all the things. And white supremacists are furious because they had told themselves that Black people were inferior, right? But a few years out of the gate of emancipation, and despite all the white violence and white racist grievance, Black people are still making significant strides. And they're making the kinds of strides that they can enjoy access to leisure, they can buy first-class tickets and accommodations. And they can do this while some poor white folks can't. And so white supremacists want none of that. And so we start to see them passing laws in these specific places where Black working class and middle and aspiring class folks are advancing and are able to sort of like show signs of significant progress, right? And so they target them with surgical precision, and that's where you see streetcars come in. Everyone isn't taking streetcars, right? Some people, they don't have the money. You think about the cost of public transportation during that time period. These are people with money to take the streetcars, right? And so what they want to do is limit their access, to shut them out, to make them know their place in the society as below white people. And so African Americans fight these laws wherever they are, and they see them as violations of their rights and infringements on their dignity, right? In public places that they are forced to take to sit in the back of the bus, et cetera. So African Americans have been fighting this since Reconstruction, but the Plessy ruling said that states, businesses, public goods, et cetera, could be segregated as long as they were equal. But white supremacists made sure they were never equal. And so if we look at this history of how segregationists built Jim Crow, we also see Black people's protests and protests of segregation and protests of segregated public transportation. This didn't start in the 1950s in places like Montgomery. Black people have been fighting since the very beginning. And this is where you get those series of boycotts in these cities. And in most instances, the cities just wait the protesters out. But in Richmond, activists are successful enough that they shut down the streetcar company. And I think that, that's an important, so they did have some victories, but not, they couldn't stop Jim Crow. And it's impossible for them to stop Jim Crow in the South with the vast majority of Black Southern men disfranchised. So disfranchisement happens first, segregation comes, right? And expands in much greater detail after that. And so what we see is that Black people are not fighting to be in physical proximity to white people. And I think that's an important thing that we need to make clear to people. They didn't believe that white people were magically, that they were somehow magical. They knew that physical proximity to white people exposed Black people to violence. And so what Black people wanted was for states and cities and businesses to respect the equal doctrine of Plessy. But respecting the equal doctrine undermined white supremacist ideas of their supposed superiority. So they universally rejected all calls to respect the law of the land, which is that if it's going to be separate, it's got to be equal. And so it's only when they refuse to sort of even do the bare minimum of equality that you start to see Black people pressing for full desegregation. And so I think knowing this history of earlier segregation, earlier fights against segregation helps us understand what happened later on in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, for sure. I just was thinking, did the Montgomery Bus Boycott organizers, were they aware of the victory in Richmond, Virginia? Is there any documentation of that you've seen?
Look, I don't know that they were aware of it. They might have been aware of the boycott, those earlier boycott campaigns, and they may have possibly sort of learned about them in their schools. They may have been passed down from family members who had maybe migrated in other places. It's not clear that they know, that the organizers of the boycott, people like Joanne Gibson Robinson, it's not clear that they, and Mary Fair Burks, it's not clear that they know for sure those earlier histories, but they might have. We just don't know.
Interesting. We'll have to talk more with Jean Theo Harris on that as well, using right away. So I have a couple questions that I'd like to follow up with as we wait for questions to come in from our groups. Excited to hear more from the groups about what they discussed. Let's see. Oh, they're coming in fast now. Let's see. Nelva said room 11 had a great conversation. Annie shared a cool resource that she is helping to create with teacher resources using Seizing Freedom. That's cool to hear. People are just making curriculum on your podcast all over. That's great to hear.
Love to hear it.
No doubt. Well, the one other episode that I just wanted to ask you about before we get to other questions is from the Children of the Sun episode. And you talk about the negative messages about Black self-worth that children got during the Jim Crow era. They received these messages from dolls that were created with racist stereotypes, from the mainstream media that reproduced these Jim Crow narratives, and they got these messages in school, right? And you talk about how the Black press and the NAACP's newspaper, The Crisis, provided important counter narratives that provided Black children with many amazing accomplishments of Black people, Black history that had been erased. Sounds very familiar to our own age, right? And just all of the contributions that Black people made in this world that were left out of the mainstream media and left out of textbooks. So I was hoping that you could talk about what the function of racist textbooks are and why textbooks have so consistently excluded honest accounts of Black history throughout U.S. history. And then what are some of the effective ways that people in the Black freedom struggle have combated the negative stereotypes, both in classrooms, but beyond that in social movements as well? And there's actually a couple of clips I would love to play that go inside the classroom and hear from the youth themselves about these the impact of these negative master narratives, and they're wanting to resist them. So if we can play those, we could start with the one from Claudia Moore, if we have that queued up.
I get so tired of hearing only white heroes and celebrating holidays in their honor. I think every year we ought to have parades or some sort of big time on Douglas's birthday and on the anniversary of Crispus Attucks' death.
Alice Martin, a student in Philadelphia, wrote about how alienated she felt in school.
Sometimes in school, I feel so badly. In the geography lesson, when we read about the different people who live in the world, all the pictures are pretty, nice-looking men and women, except for the Africans. They always look so ugly. I don't mean to make fun of them, for I am not pretty myself. But I know not all colored people look like me. Last week, girls across the aisle from me in school looked at the picture and laughed and whispered something about it to her friend. And they both looked at me. It made me so angry.
Yeah, talk about that.
So these are, I just put in the chat some resources there. So these are stories, or these are letters that young people wrote to the editors of the Brownies book. And the Brownies book was a special issue of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis. And what Du Bois wanted to do in creating the magazine was do something that Black parents had been doing all along, which is try to counter the racist narratives and the racist images that white supremacists have been creating about Black people. Now, you sort of have to think about the kind of upbringing that Black parents in this era would have received. Their parents had come out of slavery, right? They were the last generation to come out of slavery. And so what's very clear is that they have a sense of self-regard of who they are as a people and as a people who survived slavery, and their possibilities and their future. And they lived through the glory of Black Reconstruction and Reconstruction's violent overthrow and abandonment. So they lived through this moment, and they're still actively trying to counter the racist caricatures that are being produced in service of Jim Crow. So what we see is parents insisting that they have Black dolls created by Black people with Black people in mind, that they have Black art, that they have Black history, et cetera. And so what the Brownies book, the editors, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, what they want to do is to provide a counter history, a more accurate history based upon, and a history of not only of Black people in the United States, but Black people around the world. So it's a really transnational text. And I put the link in the chat so teachers can access the digitized versions of the Brownies book. And you can sort of see the kind of images, the kind of poetry, the kind of world that they were trying to show Black youth. And their possibilities, what they celebrated. They invited parents to send in stories. They invited parents to send in images of their children. And they have a section called the Little People of the Week. So they would celebrate like the accomplishments of Black children all over the country. And so like they're doing this work, actively doing this work, trying to counter the stories that they know that kids are receiving in predominantly white classrooms and from white teachers who may be racist. And so this question about the textbooks, I think it's important because you think about K through 12 education as being in the service of like the socializing mission, right? To socialize young people to be good, faithful, loyal citizens, and often unthinking ones. Right. I think about like David Blight has this great piece called Wake Up the Sleeper. And he quotes James Baldwin, who says that Americans like to use words like freedom, liberty, democracy, equality to cover the sleeper, not to wake them up. And so like this way, the sort of like, Americans have thrown out this language. We have freedom, liberty, democracy, et cetera. And that's the end. We don't need to think about it. We don't need to acknowledge who's being ignored, who's being denied, who this freedom, who has enjoyed the privileges of American freedom and who's been denied it. But Black people haven't been denied this history. No, you can't not talk about it, right? You can't live in the world, you can't live upright in the world and not talk about this history and not know why it is the way it is and the consequences that it has for Black people. And so you see this push, this constant push for a more accurate, honest education. And you see that not only from parents, but you see it from activists and scholars and educators, people like Carter G. Woodson, who are saying, we need a more accurate, fair, representative history. Du Bois calling the history that white Southern historians wrote about Reconstruction propaganda, right? Calling them out on the gross distortion of the history. And so that has been like the work of African Americans. I think about the historian Nathan Huggins, who says that Black history is a deforming mirror of truth. Right? For the stories the nation has told about itself. The nation puts on the high gloss shine, but the experience of Black and brown people in this country reveal the truth. Like it's the history that Baldwin sort of describes as, more beautiful and more terrible. right, than anything anyone can ever imagine. So this is the sort of tension, like the nation wants the sort of nice whitewashed history that's really comfortable for white people, right? But that history makes it impossible for them and for others to understand the world we live in today. And to agitate and fight for a more just future, which is why we have all of these white comfort bills, right? They're designed to comfort white people, to make sure that they don't think too much, to cover the sleeper. We have American freedom, liberty, and democracy, and you don't need to think any more about it, right? Not to wake them up.
That's right.
Not to make them sort of do the work of preserving American freedom and liberty and equality and justice for all.
Yeah, no doubt. And in the wake of the 2020 uprising, a lot of racists got very scared that people were waking up, that, described as the broadest protest in US history. I think they were especially scared that white youth were being influenced by Black youth who were building these rallies everywhere and were joining these movements in unprecedented numbers. And that's really, I think.
And then people were discussing the history, right? You've got Ferguson syllabus. You've got Charleston syllabus, right? Where, you've got these larger people who are saying, after these, incredible, and horrifying events in Ferguson with Mike Brown's killing, with the massacre at Mother Emanuel, in Charleston, you've got a lot of white people saying, well, why didn't I know this history? Right? How do we not know this? The same people who said, this isn't who we, January 6th, this isn't who we are, historians would like a word, right? But then, the follow-up to that is, why didn't we know this? And so there is this clamoring for more accurate history that would help people understand the world we live in, and that would make people sort of fight for a more just present and future. And that's what they're afraid of. Right? Yeah. It's not just sort of like white, it's, white people sort of waking up, part of what's going on is waking up to the reality of having been lied to.
Yes, exactly right. And that's why I think those narratives of learning loss are one-sided and distorting, because Black youth rose up in the 2020 uprising and educated the entire nation about systemic racism, right? And then to say that they're hopelessly behind and at a deficit and could never catch up, I thought did a real disservice. Of course, there's going to be setbacks when we're learning remotely and there's a pandemic, and we should acknowledge those setbacks, but also let's acknowledge the incredible wisdom of Black youth who are not only students, but taking on the role of educator as well. Like you said, so many people began learning the history. And I think that's what scared these racists in power who are passing these bills. So there's some good questions coming in, but there's still time to get more questions in. So we'd love, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. And I really liked the episode of the podcast you did called The Fight of the Century. And you look at some of the important debates between Black intellectuals and Black organizers and activists that I learned a lot from, and I hadn't thought of in particularly precisely those ways, because I learned the debate about whether to accept segregation and improve upon it or to overthrow it altogether as a debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And you expand that greatly in ways that I think every educator here should take note of and rethink how they teach that era. And so just hoping you could comment more about the way your podcast brings up the important role of Ida B. Wells in those debates. I deeply respected her work around anti-lynching campaigns, but I don't think I fully connected how she was an important pole of intellectual weight in that struggle against Booker T. Washington's view. And then also William Monroe Trotter, who just the firebrand. And I think he very rarely gets taught about in school. So if you could comment on that, I'd be grateful.
So in the fight of the century, what we wanted to do was to tell the story of the fight at the beginning of the century for free Black destiny, right? To try to figure out their way ahead after Jim Crow sort of, starts to come into shape. And it's not just one fight, it's a series of fights between different people. And you often, the way I learned it in school was just that it was Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but that is a really narrow version of that history, and it excludes, so what you get is a conservative position, Black conservative position, and a Black moderate position. And what is really curious is that people in telling this history have left out the radicals. And it's convenient that it's a woman, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and that it's William Monroe Trotter, so Du Bois, they are to the left of Du Bois, and they are fighting for, I think it's important to sort of, as you teach this, to understand that they, in many respects, have the same end goal. They have different ideas about how to get there, right? And what there looks like, one could argue too. And so you see people, what we wanted to do was to bring in, to make sure the audience understood who Booker T. Washington was, what he was fighting for, why, how he came to that viewpoint, and how he fought to control Black people's futures and their destinies, and what activists like Du Bois and the people who are challenging him are up against. So they have to fight the wizard of Tuskegee. And he's amassed all of these resources in order to undermine anyone who challenges him. Sounds familiar, I'm sure, to some things that are happening today. So you could sort of draw parallels so that you could sort of look at some of the parallel practices in terms of conservative practices, including Black conservative practices in the present day. And so we wanted to sort of tell that story, to flesh out like what these fights, what they looked like, what they were about. So this isn't just about segregation. This is also about education, right? People like Booker T. Washington are saying industrial education is the only education that matters. And Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a teacher and a mother, said, you don't know how many Black diamonds in the rough there are down there in the South. Mm-hmm. And, and a commitment to industrial education cuts off all of their possibilities. And, and they're clear in saying industrial education on its own is not a bad thing. Like vocational education isn't a bad thing today, right? But what they're saying is that Black people should have opportunity. They should be able to decide for themselves the kinds of schools they're going to go to so they can chart their own destiny. And they shouldn't have someone like Booker T. Washington in a position and using his influence to shut out opportunities and trying to sort of act as a spokesperson for all Black people. And Trotter's position is that Booker T. Washington represents himself. He does not speak for all Black people. And Carrie Greenidge's new-ish book, Black Radical, I think does a fantastic job of telling that story. And there are plenty of biographies on Ida B. Wells Barnett that sort of do that work too, But I think it's sort of like reading them, understanding who they were, Trotter and Wells Barnett, who they were, put people like Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, they sort of throw them into relief, if you will.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
So we wanted to tell a more complex story.
Yeah, you certainly did in that episode. The spy networks that Booker T. Washington employed, I did not know that. Spying on Black activists to try to get dirt on them, to sabotage,
undermine them.
Wow.
Yes, to kneecap them, to do whatever he could to hold on to power.
Wow.
Right, and and white influence and that white philanthropic money. Right, he was willing to do whatever it took.
Wow. I guess white supremacy is a hell of a drug. He was hooked on it, on carrying out those orders. Yeah, powerful episode. So there's, you started talking about Ida B. Wells Barnett and her contribution, and there was one of the groups that discussed more about women's contributions to the Black freedom struggle. Suzanne said at one point, one point that resonated in the group was the role of women in these resistance movements. She would just appreciate learning more about voices and stories of women. So I don't know if there's other examples that you can want to highlight as well.
Well, I think there are a lot of examples. You raised a point earlier, and I didn't interject, but there's a tendency to not think about Black women as intellectuals, right? Even in the 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century, but they are absolutely intellectuals and activists. You know, so you've got Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, you've got Anna Julia Cooper, you've got Josephine Rustin, Mary Church Terrell, and I'm mentioning these names of women whose writings and whose activism is well documented and it's available online. And they're members of the National Association of Colored Women. They're doing activist work. They're working in their churches. They're working in schools. They're working in communities. They're running public health campaigns. We're in a pandemic, a global pandemic right now, but they're leading fights against tuberculosis. They're leading campaigns to have Black Southerners, immunized as you start to get new vaccines coming online. They are actively doing the work, but they're not only activists, they are intellectuals too. And we've got all of their writings, we've got a lot of their materials that are available so you can help see who they were. And what we do in the show and what you see, what you hear of Ida B. Wells, that comes from her own writings, on Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, where she essentially reads him for filth. But she's not alone in that, right? In that broad, sort of like really pointed critique. And you think about someone like Maggie Lena Walker, from Richmond, she's doing the work. She's got this great speech that she gives to Black men where she calls them out for their failure to do their failure to support Black businesses in the community. It's not like a large conversation for everyone. She specifically calls Black men out and has like a little come to Jesus conversation with them about the work they need to be doing to support the people. And that kind of record is available online for teachers to assign and work through with their students about the sort of internal politics between Black people, not only just in relation to white people or in opposition to Black people or to white people, but what they're doing themselves in order to nurture the freedom movement.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of intellectual activists, Black women, we have Judy Richardson with us here this evening, who is also a hero of mine that has done so much for this Black freedom struggle. But I think that I really love the way you frame that, because I think there's begun to be a corrective. Certainly hasn't gone nearly far enough, but there's begun to be more of a wider understanding of the role that Black women played central roles in the civil rights movement or previous struggles. But I think even there, often their intellectual contributions aren't discussed. And it's more like they were the activists carrying out so much of the work, but in terms of driving the ideas, still Black men's ideas are getting privileged. And I think, looking at your work and so many others, what I've learned from Jean Theo Harris about the intellectual contribution of Rosa Parks, not just her refusing to move from her seat, is some of the hard work that we educators need to do, because that's not done for us in the textbooks, right? So thank you for that. Let's see what other questions are coming in. I think we have time maybe for one or two more, but we hope that you'll stay with us and be sure before anyone leaves, there is an important evaluation form that we hope everyone will fill out. Let's see. Martha asked, is there an episode with the voices and experiences of Buffalo soldiers? I couldn't remember.
So not so much with Buffalo soldiers. We do talk in the first season in like episode 8.1 and 8.2, a little bit about, heading west. And so we talk a little bit about them, but it's not as much in the Buffalo soldiers' own words as what's happening in terms of Black people seizing freedom by moving west And we know that Buffalo Soldiers are part of that movement, but it's a much larger movement, this larger exodus or campaign as Black Southerners are leaving the South and they're trying to pursue their freedom in the West and the challenges they're facing there, right? Because the West isn't it's not an empty place. They are moving into Native American spaces, so they're seizing their own freedom, but they're often moving into Native American spaces, and they're not escaping white racism either. They're encountering it in the West as well. So not so much the Buffalo Soldiers as the larger movement West and what's happening in the region.
Right on, right on. Let's see. I guess I just want to ask you about what the plans are moving forward as a final way to wrap up here. What kind of themes should we be expecting are going to come up on future episodes of the podcast? And I think especially for educators in the states where these white comfort laws have passed, I've seen a lot in the chat about how do we get around these laws? How do we teach the truth anyway? And I think your podcast could be one really great tool for helping get these messages out, this history out. So what kind of history are you going to be diving into?
So we don't know whether or not we're going to get a third season, but we have 2 more episodes from this season. And the next one will drop in the morning. And we're really excited about it. If you love Ida B. Wells, you will love tomorrow's episode. Tomorrow's episode. I won't go into detail, but it's African Americans seizing control of narratives of white supremacy in the context of Red Summer. So I'll only go that far. Yeah. And we have our last interview. I won't name who our last interview is, but it's amazing.
Yes.
And so I hope everyone will sort of listen to all the episodes, but definitely listen to the next 2 episodes that are coming up. I think that, on the one hand, people have said that they imagine that a show like Seizing Freedom would sort of pass the muster, that it would be okay to teach, in light of all of the white comfort bills. And I don't know that it would be, in the sense that it is disrupting this narrative, this white sort of driven narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I understand and respect the difficult position teachers find themselves in. But I hope that, I know that people here are sort of ready for that fight, that they are fighting that good fight and making the case for why this more accurate history matters, because it matters absolutely for people to, for our young people to understand the world we live in today. You can't understand an event like January 6th unless you understand the larger history. You can't understand the economic and environmental issues that we're living with right now if you don't understand this larger history. So I think the work needs to be done, but I also think the work needs to be done challenging and calling in and out if necessary. The ways that these bills do nothing to address the active harms that are happening in classrooms with racist teachers, right? So it's one thing to have a problematic textbook. It's another to have a teacher who forces children, Black children, to reenact, slave sales, right? There's a specific kind of violence that's being done there. And it's not accidental, it's not innocent, it's not oops racism, it's kind of violent racism. And we need more honest acknowledgement about that. These teachers are not ignorant of the history. They go out of their way to teach, to sort of teach a distorted history. And the question is how to address that in our schools, in our own schools, when we hear about it happening, et cetera. Black parents can't be the only ones who are challenging these problematic lesson plans. So I think this is part of this sort of larger fight the bills, teach more accurate histories, but also challenge those who are distorting the history in your own class, in your own schools and in your own school districts. Because what Black parents are told is that, they're sort of shut down. No one has ever complained before, right? Without acknowledging why other parents may not, or why other children may not have felt safe to complain, after a horrible lesson plan or experience like that. So it's hard work, but I think we who believe in truth, we who believe in justice, we will continue to fight this fight and using the sort of good evidence of history in order to do that.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really an honor to be here with you tonight. I want to urge all the educators to get this book. They left great marks on me, and to check out the Seizing Freedom podcast and share it with your colleagues as just vital resources for the work that we're doing. So now we want your feedback on this session, both the content and the format. We've put a link in the chat box so that you can do that. But before you do the evaluation, can everybody please unmute yourself and just share your thank yous to each other for your commitment to this work, and also to all our guests.
Thank you.
Dr. Williams.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing
Thank you so
amazing
much.
work.
This was excellent.
Thank you so
much. My dog is actually really excited right now. So. He says thank you.